Okay, that's what I was waiting for. Good morning. Can you all hear me? Thumbs up. Yeah, excellent, excellent. Look at that. All right. So this is me. My name is Scott Paddock, and this is everything you wanted to know about compliance but were afraid to ask. And I'll address the elephant in the room. I don't know quite how you're going to ask those questions because look at us. We're doing a headphone microphone kind of a thing. So I had baked in some time for questions and answers, and I'm going to stick to it, but we'll have to do it manually or in an analog capacity after. So what I'll do is I will run through this deck, and I'll also take a quick minute to explain kind of what this information is trying to solve or resolve. I've been with Amazon coming up on 5 years, and I have been working as a security solutions architect for most of that time. I recently transferred into our compliance department, and because of that, I see kind of both sides of the fence where compliance is concerned. From the customer perspective, I've got years of that kind of work, as well as now on the other side, I can see kind of where the problems manifest themselves, where we're trying to share information. The one thing that I find is uniform. We hire a ton of people, and maybe you're part of that equation, maybe you're doing something similar in your own organization. The people who are coming in do not have a clear understanding of, or really even a familiarity of so many of these compliance programs that are really important to the organization. Because of that, it's a danger, because if they don't know and someone presses them for a question, they're liable to guess or wing it or do something dangerous like that. This presentation is meant to introduce you to a host of different compliance topics, as well as explain who cares about them, what kinds of controls are included in them, where they apply, how AWS supports them. And then I also have some information about, after this is over, where you can go to get more information about any of these or how AWS supports any of these. So this is very much a get acquainted with your friendly neighborhood auditor and your friendly neighborhood compliance topic on a great big screen for us. So with that being framed as an intro, let's dive in. Well, we'll talk about what they are, where they fit, that kind of information. How do we go about compliance at AWS might be important if you are relying on us for one of these. What this work means, the work that we're doing in compliance, and how you can get help. All right. So what are they? Well, it's always good, I find, to start any kind of a presentation with a noteworthy quote. The idea here is that I think more often than not, compliance and to a similar degree security get lumped into these are the blockers. These are the impediments. These are the people who always say no, and they get in our way and they prevent us from doing fantastic, wonderful stuff. I'm not convinced that that's really the lay of the land here. I would encourage, and I certainly adhere to the point of view that the compliance and security folks are the ones who are helping you genuinely get to a successful outcome, because they're making sure that all the little steps got dealt with or handled appropriately along the way. There's really no point in saying, I want you to do it this way or not do it at all, if that's what the business needs to accomplish. I mean, the workflow should really count for something. And this quote seems to kind of put an interesting lens on that. Do it my way as soon as we've discussed it, but then do it my way. That's I think, a reputation that we need to try to put down. So some of these, and I grabbed these icons from our public webpage, you may have seen them already. We're at about 60-ish different compliance programs that we support at AWS. Some of them you certainly have never heard of and probably have no occasion to worry about. Others, however, are going to be more important. ISO, PCI, SOC. These terms come up a lot, and if they are terms that you've heard and you don't fully understand or appreciate, let this be a gateway to your learning and understanding of them, because they do matter and they come up over and over again. Okay, here are some of the industries. I'm starting from the top down. I'm going to drill in a little bit here. We've got financial organizations of all shapes and sizes, stock brokerages, banks, credit unions, all sorts of financial entities have their own slice of this puzzle. Insurance, whether that is medical or otherwise, will have interest in this space. Healthcare, of course, I mean, everybody's heard of HIPAA by now, I'm sure, and hopefully that is more than just the paper that you sign off at the doctor's office that you don't read and you pass back to them. It's a deeper topic, and it was worth more attention than that. Government, public sector, certainly has their own set of rules. Energy is, well, I don't think I'm going to characterize this unfairly if I say it's a bit of a mess right now. They have certainly some regulations, but I don't know that they are necessarily where they need to be. And if you are in the energy space, maybe let's talk afterward, because there's a lot that we're trying to help on that front. And education. The previous speaker up here, if anyone was in this area for that, was talking about a standard called FERPA, which is dead set on education. It's got to do with student data and lending. So, diving in further, financial customers, banks, credit unions, and so on, will care about these. The PCI's full name is PCI DSS. It is the Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard. This is one of the odd ducks in the list because PCI is not a regulation, it's not law. The way that PCI works is it's an industry consortium, meaning the credit card companies have jointly put this together to say that these are the controls that we care about, and if you don't meet them, you don't go to jail. This isn't a criminal matter, but what they can do is refuse to honor your transactions. So you're effectively no longer in the credit card game. That has a fair amount of material that we support. We are PCI level 1 processor. That may or may not be applicable to you if you need processing, but the standards are of the highest level that we have at AWS for PCI. FFIEC, these are fun. These relate to banks, and when banks get examined, whether they are being examined for their financial stress testing, or if the work that I have done with the banks has been disaster recovery. You know, if this building had a gas leak and blew up, could you have tellers in windows the following 48 hours later? The FFIEC covers all kinds of stuff related to banks and their stability. SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, that's a government agency, but this particular rule of theirs is what we're calling out. The SEC Rule 17A-4(F) rolls off the tongue. Everybody loves to say that one at parties. This has to do with data storage integrity. So if you have transactional data about a market trade or something along those lines, how are you keeping that data secure? How are you sure that you're not having it being tampered with? That's a 17A-4(F) rule. We also support that. And FISC is Japanese. I'm not sure how many folks are here from Japan or have business interests there, but it's a very similar kind of a mechanism to the FFIEC, except it's specific to the Japanese market. Healthcare, okay, I threatened you with HIPAA, here's more. HIPAA came along in '96, and for the casual observer, one of the big things that it did was allow you, as a patient, to have access to your medical records. Prior to 1996, you couldn't see what was in there. And so if your doctor was cross-eyed or had some other problem and said you had 3 legs and 5 arms, you had to live with that. You couldn't appeal it, you couldn't know what was in it. Opening the folder on that file happened in 1996. HIPAA gets maligned for a lot of other reasons. In '96, when it launched, it didn't have teeth, meaning if you were not compliant, there was really kind of not a whole lot that was going to happen to you. So it didn't have a very swift uptake. That changed with the High-Tech Act that came along after and kind of gave it some bite. You could now get fines that would be leveraged by the Office of Civil Rights. And the HITRUST CSF, that's a confusingly similar name, so let me be clear on the two of these. High-Tech is an amendment to HIPAA. HITRUST is a different thing altogether. It is a consortium-based, the CSF stands for Common Security Framework. Framework or Foundation? Framework. One of the problems that HIPAA has, if you want to call it a problem, is that there is no audit standard. If there's a certain standard that you want to be certified for, your organization has said to you, we'd really like to be ISO 27001 certified. Okay. What that says to you is that behind the model is an audit standard. An auditor can show up and has a checklist or more than a checklist, but a series of things that they're looking for that are set and specific, so that they can say, yes, you're doing it, no, you're not doing it, or we need to have a deeper dive, or maybe a corrective action, something along those lines. Very straightforward. HIPAA doesn't have one of those, and that's a problem, because a lot of the healthcare organizations are trying to figure out a way to get HIPAA certified, which you can't do without an audit standard. That's where HITRUST comes in. HITRUST is an amalgamation of the controls that are necessary for HIPAA compliance in one security framework that is an auditable standard. In other words, an auditor can show up and say, I'm here to do your HITRUST CSF audit. Now, I don't know that they're going to take it to the full measure of the certification, but it at least is an audit standard, and that's the part that people care about. So if you get these in your crosshairs and someone is saying, well, what about HITRUST? What they're probably asking you is, do we have a mechanism that has any credibility? That's not just a self-attestation of compliance, where some third party has come along and said, yeah, they're doing it right. That's the part of the puzzle that this is trying to fill. The last one here, GXP, is written that way on purpose. The model here is good something practices. The something is a variable. It could be lab, it could be manufacturing, it could be clinical. There are an awful lot of things that could be in that middle character. They're normally oriented around quality. So if I were to talk about this in the parlance of ISO, as an example, ISO has a number of different standards. On the previous slide here, you see that there were 4 different ISO standards in this list, and that's not by accident. These are different standards from the same company, the same organization, that are dealing with different things. The one that you're probably going to encounter most is ISO 27001. This audit standard is a risk management framework at a very high level. It is also, coincidentally, very much in lockstep with GDPR, which I haven't mentioned yet, but I will, the European privacy ruling that is more recent. GXP is a different kind of an animal, because instead of trying to manage the risk, it's trying to manage the quality of something. And the nearest ISO standard to that would be the ISO 9001 standard, if you have any familiarity with that. That is a quality control. So instead of saying, I'm worried about this particular thing happening and I need to have controls and mitigations in place so that bad guys or misconfigurations or whatever it is don't happen, from a risk perspective, GXP and ISO 9001 are saying, if I'm going to make 100,000 of these widgets, how many of these are going to be problematic? Because maybe it's a heart valve. And if I've got 40 out of 100,000, that's 40 dead people, and I can't have that. I need to have something that is nearing to zero or a diminishing point. So this is a quality-oriented control, and it's one of the few that are quality-oriented. Almost all of the rest are risk-oriented. Okay, government, public sector stuff. FedRAMP. This story actually starts a little earlier. In 2002, there was a regulation called FISMA, the Federal Information Systems Management Act, and that was intended to explain to government agencies what their obligations were when they are dealing with sensitive data, how to protect it, how to store it, how to manage who's accessing it. And that's great. It did a fair amount of legwork, and then the cloud model came along, and FISMA didn't quite seem to fit very well, because it was really organized and engineered around an on-premises model. And we're pretty far beyond that, most of us these days. So FedRAMP came along, which was, the whole point of FedRAMP was to get the federal agencies moving toward a cloud-first model. That cloud-first adoption model was what this is driving. So it's the same control set as same control set as FISMA. It relies on a document called NIST SP, which stands for Special Publication 800-53. I tell you these names, they just roll right off the tongue. You're going to be buzzwording and having alphabet soup in your head later on today, and I apologize for that. The standard, however, is something that is very verbose, and they have different implementation models or mechanisms, meaning while they both rely on this NIST standard that I mentioned, the implementation guidance changes slightly, because for FedRAMP, they know it's a cloud service provider. So that changes the landscape just enough that they need to look at these controls through a different lens. There are tiers, by the way, on that NIST standard I mentioned. There's the low, moderate, and high tier. And if you need to know the difference between those, the data owner, if you're, let's say for the sake of argument, you're dealing with the Veterans Administration and you've got some medical record data of theirs that you're doing something with, they should be able to tell you what the tier is. Is this a moderate or a high tier? And then you can respond accordingly. The data owner should have that knowledge top of mind. CJIS was another one that was mentioned here on this stage a little earlier. That's the Criminal Justice Information Standards, and that would be related to law enforcement. You know, when someone gets arrested, or when they have some sort of a court-ordered or other, I mean, I'm trying to think of all the possible things. I guess if I were more of a criminal and I could tell you about the the various mechanisms, this is certainly something that has a lot of importance. I don't know that I have the best bird's eye view on the breadth of this. In other words, it covers civil and criminal, and that's about as far as I remember it, so there could be some outliers or gotchas of note there. FIPS is the Federal Information Processing Standard. FIPS is, I only really hear of one of them, and that's the FIPS 140-2 standard. Seems to be the only one that gets discussed with any regularity. And that has to do with encryption standards that federal agencies are able to use in their protection along with all this other stuff. So if for the sake of argument we say FedRAMP has an obligation to encrypt your data, then FIPS would be the measure by which, if you said I want to use AES 256, that's good. If you said I wanted to use triple DES, that's not good. And FIPS will be the one that determines which are eligible for use and not. And then NIST I mentioned earlier too. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and they write tons of documentation. It's almost like written by the pound. It's vast, but it's also very good stuff, and it's highly detailed. So if you're starting fresh, there's an awful lot that NIST has to offer that might give you a leg up on your work as you try to adopt a compliance standard. Okay, and then anybody, any industry, anywhere, might ask you about these. These are very broad. ISO, the International Standards Organization, we have those 4 standards, the 27001 that I mentioned being risk-oriented, the 9001 being quality-oriented. We also have 2 more recent editions, 27017 and 27018, which have to do with cloud service providers and privacy specifically. There's more. Those are the ones that I hear about most frequently. And certainly, if you have others that you care about, let me know. This is all I see day over day. SOC. SOC reports are tricky because if you think I have been giving you alphabet soup so far, this is a whopper. The organization is the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. They formerly had a standard. You may, if you've been in the IT game long enough, you may have heard SAS 70. Was one of theirs. It was an accounting standard, and it kind of got used in a square peg, round hole kind of a fashion. What the nature of the landscape was at the time, there were burgeoning application service providers, or ASPs, who were taking applications and hosting them on the web. And somebody was asking, okay, how do we know from an audit perspective if they have all of their controls in order for this hosted offering? And there really wasn't a standard available at the time that did a good job of explaining or measuring that. So people would use this AICPA SAS 70 model, which was the kind of closest thing you could get your hands on to that model. After a while, the CPA folks just gave up and said, okay, if you're going to use it that way, we'll tailor it that way. We'll make it more appropriate. And they came out with a standard called SSAE, which is now up to version 18. So you'll hear SSAE 18. It's just the inheritor or the offspring of SAS 70, same organization. It involves 3 different report types. This is where the rubber meets the road, because all that other stuff is not on the quiz. The SOC reports have 3 types. One of them is the sort of the traditional financial services model. Will this company be able to keep the lights on? You know, are they going to make payroll? Is everything stable on that side? Then the type 2 report has to do with technical controls, the ones that the industry has been asking for. Do they have separation of duties? Do they have all the kind of the normal governance controls that you would expect to see in a mature process and organization? The third report is a real simple, almost like a certification. It simply says that this work has been done. It doesn't give you any of the details. It's really only a proof that the auditors came in, did the work, and finished. So you've got 3 different SOC reports. My bet is most of you will care about SOC report 2. That's the one that has the technical controls. CSA, this is the Canadian Standards Association. There's also a CSA that's the Cloud Services Alliance. It's an overloaded acronym. If you are Canadian, certainly you'll need to be aware of these. I don't know that they are remarkable beyond, in the same sense that ISO and SOC are. They're, nation state specific, so it's unlikely that you'll hear about this particular CSA in Denmark, but who knows. GDPR. I mentioned that one earlier, and there's a lot to dive into on this one. And I don't know that I have the answer to all of the questions. For example, GDPR includes something called right to be forgotten, which is a hotly debated topic, meaning if I am a customer of yours, and I come to you, and I'm in the European Union. This is a European Union regulation. It is meant to be extraterritorial, so if I'm a European Union resident, and I live in the United States and I'm doing business with you, I'm still supposed to have these protections because it's tied to me. Do I have to be in? I can't remember now if I have to be in Europe for any particular. It gets very muddy in a hurry, but this is a European program. I would ask of you that you forget me, forget my identity, so that you then need to go have a process. Okay, Scott has asked that I purge his records. That's a headache. How do I have to do this? Do I have to manually mount my backups and then find him in my backups and eject him? It's kind of up in the air. I would say consult your legal counsel on this one because I don't know that I've seen any consistency on the answer yet. There's another part of this that is a little bit touchy, which is they are regarding an IP address as something that is personally identifiable. Really? So all of us at Panera Bread on the Wi-Fi there doing our thing, we're all one person apparently. I don't know how mechanically that's meant to work. There's a lot to unpack here, and if you have questions about it, I will endeavor to answer them to the best of my ability after we get to the, back to the manual communication model. Okay, how do we go about compliance at AWS? Well, our approach involves something that I hope by now you have heard about, the Shared Responsibility Model. If you have not, I'll touch on that just for a quick moment. When you do business with a cloud service provider, there are things that they do for you to make your life easier. Physical security, top of mind. You no longer have to worry about the guards, guns, and gates and all that kind of happy jazz because someone else is doing it for you. Now, that is a real easy carve out because logical access gets a little bit more complicated. That still remains in your court. What you find is there are things that the cloud service provider will do for you, and there are things that you remain responsible for, and then there are things that might be a blended combination of both. So I suppose the prevailing message is you still have skin in the game. This is not I've signed up with AWS, I'm off to holiday in Cancun or someplace because now I know it's all just sorted. It's not that easy. It would be nice, and we can try to further get you to that point where you're off to leave a vapor trail and go have a holiday. But there's still the idea that you know your data best, and if you have an occasion where like it's a human resources folder, and you've got Alice and Bob, and they are your employees, and Alice should have access, but Bob should not, how on earth would we know? Again, this is none of our business. It's not anything that we need to know about. We provide you with the tooling so that you can enforce that Alice can get in and Bob cannot, but it comes down to you to know how it's supposed to work, and then we can make it mechanically work. So that's kind of where the shared responsibility model comes in, and one of the things that I have heard feedback that's been very popular on the topic of our PCI materials. I mentioned that we're having about 60-ish different compliance programs. Most of these have an output product. It's either a memorandum of understanding or an auditor's attestation or statement. It could be an authorization to operate, or it could be a certification. There's something that happens at the end of this that says, we're done, and here's what we have. When it's PCI, for example, we share that material as long as the the audit report is successful. If we failed it, obviously we'd have to go back to the drawing board, but it's been successful, it remains so. We share with you these materials as well as a responsibility matrix to say, okay, there are 12, 13, depending on how you count them, controls for PCI. And some of these involve that sharing or blending of responsibility that I'm describing with the shared responsibility model. We want to be very clear, these are the things that we will do, these are the things that you will do, and together we will be successful as we try to satisfy these control objectives. So it comes up over and over again. The PCI one, I think, is the one that I hear most frequently about how much it's helping customers get their heads wrapped around what it is that they need to do. Because that's a question that I hear all the time. Okay, now that I know what they are, and now that I know the control objectives, I still don't know what part of this AWS does. How do I fill in the pieces? That's an occasion to reach out to your account SA or reach out to support if you have support. We can get you those answers, and we provide those materials, the various outputs or final stage products of these standards, through our service called Artifact. If you've never seen it before, it's in the console. You can search for it by name. I believe it's under governance and reporting as the category. And if you never used it before, the first time around it will say, okay, part of the big equation is you need to sign this NDA because it's sensitive stuff. And so you one time agree to the NDA and then it doesn't bother you anymore about that. And you can go to Artifact and then download the SOC reports, the PCI package, the, what else would be there, the ISO certifications. It's a pretty long list of materials that are available to you. Why? Well, the idea here is that we want to lighten your load if you're trying to become certified or pass an audit standard. If you need to be PCI compliant, if you are trying to become ISO certified, we want to make that burden as light as possible. So we'll give you these materials, which you can then present to your auditor, and the auditor can say, okay, well, from the perspective of, let's say, I hear this term used, and I have mixed emotions about it, but the hypervisor down to bare metal or brick level, that's held, managed by AWS. Now, with that being the case, and with this material already being done, we've got a report from the auditor that says that past ISO, past PCI, whatever it is we're talking about, I'd like to now focus on what we've built on AWS from our organization, because that's the last leg, that's the last step. And then the auditor focuses on what you have built, and at the end, everyone is happy and you are successful and the fairy tale continues. That's the goal that we're trying to put together for you so that it becomes far easier than having to start your conversation with your auditor at that brick level. Some of this other stuff is worth calling out. The one that I think is really impressive that my organization has been doing lately with considerable success is services and regions being compliant at launch. So one of the things that we heard about a lot was, you've got this great new service, Lambda, okay, pick one, something that everybody likes right out of the gate, and it's not yet in scope for any of these audit standards. I can't use it. Oh, what a bummer. Well, it doesn't have to be. We have some lead time, and most of these standards have been very accommodating to allow us to say, okay, the part of the equation that gets a little touchy is some of these standards will say, I really insist that you have 6 months of runtime so that we can see an accurate representation of how this service or this region or whatever it is that we're talking about will operate. And we're trying to, to work with them to satisfy their concerns and also to speed up that process. We've launched regions and services with compliance now pretty reliably, and that has been a huge victory, I think, for the team and has been very well received. So if you hear about a new service going forward, and you're thinking, oh, well, it'll be nice when the day rolls around that I can finally use it because it's finally in scope for PCI or ISO or whatever it is that I need to have, you're going to be happy to hear most of the time those are ready to go right out of the gate. So that's a big deal. And raising the bar, and well, this is one of the ways that we raise the security and compliance bar. We don't want to have to make you wait. If we have a service that we are comfortable and confident in that we're launching and saying it's already gone through its audit cycles on these various compliant programs and is in scope and has passed, you're off to the races. So that's kind of a big deal, and I don't want to break my arm patting ourselves on the back, but it doesn't come easily. That's tough work. I mentioned Artifact. So for those service or for those standards that have an output product, that's what the icon looks like. This is in your console, and it is the same for everybody. And what I mean by that is, if you have, and I'm going to give you the tricky example because I think this comes up more frequently. Let's say, for the sake of argument, your business has other customers who would care about compliance things. So it's no longer a matter or a question of how do you get an ISO or a SOC report from us, because we've already got that covered. The question now becomes, how do I get that to my customer who's asking me the same question that I was asking you? Well, there are a couple of ways to skin this cat, and one of them is very easy. If your customer already has an AWS account, even if it's just for sandbox testing, it doesn't make any difference. They can do the exact same thing you can. They can log in, agree to that NDA, and download all this same stuff because it's not account specific. My account, your account, we all get the same PCI, ISO, SOC, FedRAMP. That's the easy part. Now, I have heard from customers who said, well, why does my customer have to have an AWS account? Doesn't that kind of invite them to leave my business and go do their own thing? Well, if that's the nature of your arrangement, then certainly we're not trying to push anybody anywhere. There's a manual process. Reach out to your account rep, and we can manually do the non-disclosure, which is really the impediment that we care about here. As long as we have a non-disclosure, we can carry forward. So whichever way makes the most sense for you, be advised they're both available so that you can satisfy your customers' requests for these kind of things if necessary. Okay, well, so I've been talking about how we go about security and compliance, and these are important call-outs. This is policy, process, controls, verification, and certification. These are the sort of the touchstones of what it means to be compliant and secure, at least within the context of what AWS is up to. And these are the materials that we're going to share, a lot of them. For example, PCI requires that you do vulnerability testing, like penetration testing of your environment. And you are, as an AWS customer, certainly eligible to do vulnerability and penetration testing on the resources that you control, to your heart's content. But what you can't do, for example, is try to blow up the the identity and access management system, something that's important to everybody to be able to log in and do your thing. So there are some rules of the road, but that doesn't mean that they don't get tested. That just simply means that we're asking that you not do it, that you leave it in the hands of, in this case, Coalfire, who's our PCI third-party attestation organization. Let them do it. And we'll provide you with the report that says, yes, these things are in scope, yes, they did the work, and then you can carry forward and focus on the things that you have built that are specific to your account and wrap up any stragglers or loose ends that way. So it's an important kind of a building or a chain model that I'm trying to describe here, but hopefully that makes sense, and these are the materials that we're sharing through Artifact to try to make that true and easy and reliable. Okay, I really wanted to have a but wait, there's more, and the image that I chose was deemed to be too commercially, like there was a brand name involved. But wait, there's more. So let me get that off the off the page here. The compliance URL that I have up here has a ton of good stuff for you. There's an entire GDPR resource center. I know that that's a popular topic lately, linked from this URL. I don't know if it's something that you were aware of, but AWS has a top-level domain now. Actually has for some time, but I don't think anyone's been using it much. There's a web page, atlas.aws is a resolvable web page, and it is a pretty slick affair. What it does is it shows you the Earth, and then you get to pick the nation state that you care about, and it will give you some pointers. Okay, in this area, these are going to be the rules of the road that you might want to be aware of. So atlas.aws is both visually kind of trippy, but also very helpful to see what is going on where. FAQs, white papers. I also had a fun graphic for yada, 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 but they said, no, I don't have permission from Seinfeld to use it, so you'll just have to imagine some Seinfeld reference there. Outliers. Okay, well, so I mentioned GDPR and all the various things that go along with that, and okay, sorry about that. This is an overloaded acronym. It's bad news. So the DPA in our case could mean the Data Protection Authority, a data privacy addendum. I think that's probably the one that comes up most. It's almost academic, and I'll explain why. when GDPR first came along, it includes something called model clauses. And these are the controls that you are meant, as a custodian of European Union subject data, to be very careful in looking after. These model clauses need to be somehow insured or assured. So if you're using a third-party organization like AWS, how can you demonstrate to your auditor that these controls are in place, that they're manifest? A DPA is a way to do that. This is an addendum to your AWS contract, and it says AWS is going to do these things, these model clauses, or standard contractual clauses. Sometimes they're referred to that way. Same animal. It's a commitment from us to you that we'll uphold these standards. Now, that got a lot of red tape, paperwork, drama going on, and in the end, we have taken the commitment to those model clauses and put them in these standard agreements. So you don't have to necessarily do anything further unless your auditor is expecting and asking of you to have a legally binding something or another, in which case the DPA is your friend. It's going to be that legally binding contract document that extends your customer agreement from whatever type it is to include these. So it gets a little bit weird, but not terribly so. RFI, RFPs, these are another thing that come up that are sort of strange but related. We get at AWS a fair number of customers who say, I would love to validate you as a supplier or a vendor, but before I can do that, I need you to fill out our security evaluation or questionnaire. And then, thump, it's like a phone book, when you print it out, it's massive. And these can be really just thousands of questions about controls, governance, oversight, that kind of stuff. Policy gets in there as well. And they're asking these questions to try to get to the bottom of whether or not we are upholding a standard that is appropriate for them to adopt and use. It makes perfect sense. The problem is, it's kind of a sinkhole for time. You can get lost, for weeks in one of these things. So we will do them, but we do them reluctantly. The preference is to try to figure out, is this a thing that genuinely needs to be on your letterhead, for example? Like your company has these questions in this order. Well, are these in some way distinctive, or might these be common enough that I could provide to you a different document that includes 1,000 plus of these type questions and answers, already answered, already vetted by AWS Legal, good to go? Would that work? Because that saves a ton of time. And if it turns out that that would work, but you still think you need to copy and paste answers, okay. It just doesn't make any difference from our point of view. We're trying to streamline the process. So that's really the only part of that equation. If we seem reluctant, it's not about you, it's not about your organization, it's about the time it takes, because when we do one of these manually, someone like me has to sit down, read each question, has to parse, what do they mean? Do they mean in the cloud, on premises, either, neither? It sometimes is very ambiguous because the questions may not have been updated in years and years. And then I answer them, and that's great, but then it has to go off to legal review. We're into weeks already, and that's kind of a drag. So don't get discouraged if you need to get one of these done, but I hope that I can invite you to open your mind and horizons a little bit about other ways of skinning that cat. Okay, what does this work mean now that we've talked about what it is and what we're doing with it? Well, the best example I can think of, we had one standard called TISAX, which is related to the automotive manufacturing industry. We did one standard adoption and unlocked for just one customer 1.2 million, and the industry is 100 million. So these little things can have a really big consequence, and not just for us. That kind of thing is an important message that you should take to heart too. If your organization is losing opportunities based upon, not TISAX specifically, but a particular standard, and you're thinking it's too burdensome or onerous to tackle, double check that. Reach out to us and let's talk about it and see if that's right, because this makes a world of difference for our customers, and I expect the same is true if you've got a lot of customers of this, of a regulated sort. These are examples, 3 that I pulled from our website, of different industries: FINRA, financial services, Talon Energy, and DNA Nexus in healthcare. These are all very different kinds of customers who have found success on AWS because of the audit support, or the audit standard support that we provide by way of Artifact and other resources. So, putting it in your court, how do you get help? Well, that compliance page that I was linking to earlier is a good start, but there's more. But wait, there's more. Cloud Adoption Framework. This is something, if you think about the OSI model and how it's figurative more than literal, meaning it doesn't have a hard and fast set of intractable rules, the Cloud Adoption Framework is much the same way. We're telling you, customers and public at large, what we see as sort of ordinary or common milestones in a customer's adoption of a cloud service provider. And this is done in the context of not just AWS, I think, but probably is applicable broadly. The message isn't that you need to follow this path. This is not prescriptive, step one, do this, step two, do that. This is saying, when a customer is on this journey, we see these kinds of things as being important and roughly in this chronology. It's food for thought. It's something that you can look at and say, well, we can strike this one because we know it doesn't apply to us, but this other one, this is a good idea, and maybe we should do this in a different sequence of events. So it's worth a look. Immersion days are something that we provide to customers where we'll have an SA or maybe a solution architect or a few pay you a visit for a day or more and give you specific training on a particular topic. Identity and access management, security, compliance. Those are the ones that I deal with. I know that there are tons. Big data, media and streaming services have their own. If you go to immersiondays.com, you can see the full catalog of various different types. These are provided through AWS sales and are typically low cost or no cost. I think most of the time they're no cost. If you were trying to draw out something beyond a week, they might start to talk about the bill. But normally these are freely available and provide a great a mechanism for you to have AWS training at your facility with your people. So it really helps warm the people. For the problem of, I have a lot of people who don't understand this stuff and they're really worried about their jobs. Let us not cause them any further panic. Let's bring them up and help them get to the point where they can feel comfortable and reduce their workload probably as well. Immersion days are a great way to get that started. Enterprise accelerators, quick start guides, quick launch. These are things where we have, one of our services called Cloud Formation allows you to take an entire environment and describe or distill that down to a few lines of code, which you could then take to a different region and spin up and have a clone, a carbon copy of whatever it is you started with. We have some of these Cloud Formation templates specific to compliance programs, like FedRAMP, like PCI, like HIPAA, where you can download the template, spin up the resources, and at that moment, you're starting clean. You've got a good, compliant environment with which to start to evaluate and assess your needs. Now, understand too that the moment you start to make changes to that environment, whether or not it's compliant becomes a matter of debate depending upon what change you've made, but you know at least you're starting on the right foot. Automation of compliance efforts is so wonderful. I cut my teeth on this back in the day when like validation was painful and it involved paperwork that you could trip over. It was nasty and it was time consuming. Automation has been a boon and virtualization has really enabled that. We can take a large number of compliance oriented controls and automate them in such a way that you no longer have to handhold them. I'll tell you, this is an extreme example, but in the healthcare space, I met with one customer who was using our tools, Code Commit, Code Deploy, and Code Pipeline. These are developer-oriented tools. They validated the tools that they were using and the process to the extent that they went to their auditor and said, we regard this process, this Code Commit, Code Deploy, and Code Pipeline, as being validated in the sense of like FDA validated, and unless we see an error or an errata of some sort, we're going to regard the workflow product that comes out of this as also being validated, and their auditor said, I got it, and it works, and I like it. That was huge. That's a watershed moment in my point of view. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening on compliance that's automation oriented, and it's only getting better. So if this kind of stuff is of interest, you're going to dig that, I assure you. And then partners, you know, there's a whole venue of them out here. I'm sure that they'd love to talk to you about these kind of things as well. A couple of URLs, if that's helpful, for partner solutions, in the specifically in the financial services and healthcare space. So, I've been going at a pretty fast pace with the understanding that we'll have questions. I am at the end of my deck, and I'm happy to answer them, but you're going to have to tell them to me in a way that I can hear you. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to stand right over here and happily field whatever questions I can for you. Thank you for coming, thank you for attending, and have a wonderful day.